What I want to speak about in this video, this next video here, is the profound importance of the Old Testament scriptures. And the Old Testaments are greatly undervalued. In 1908, the Gideon Society, I believe they're called, started handing out New Testament versions of the Bible. You can't really call it a Bible without the Old Testament anyway. But what I want to kind of share is how dangerous that is, how dangerous it is to ignore the Old Testament scriptures. Christ himself said, if they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither would they be convinced if someone rose from the dead. He said that in Luke 16. Now, that means this: if you just have the New Testament scriptures and you don't have the proof that prophecy prophesied concerning Christ in the New Testament from the Old Testament scriptures, you literally have nothing. The New Testament is only of great value because of its attachment to the Old Testament. Christ in John chapter 5 verse 46 says, for had they believed Moses, they would have believed me, for he wrote of me. If they believe not his writings, how shall they believe my words? So what is the New Testament without the Old Testament? How can they believe Christ's words without the Old Testament? They must have that Old Testament proof, proving that Christ is the Messiah, in order for the New Testament to truly be valid. If you look at Christ's labors, when he resurrected from the dead, what he did is that he went immediately. If you look at Luke 24, 27 and 44, he immediately went to Moses and the prophets to speak to them concerning the things concerning himself. He proved everything from the Old Testament. He didn't work a miracle. He didn't speak in tongues. He went straight to Old Testament Bible prophecy to convince the disciples on the road to Emmaus that he was who he said he was. And like I said in the last video, Isaiah 41 verse 23 calls it the God test. Show the things that shall be hereafter, right, that we may know that you're God. So the way you prove that God is in something is to prove the future. Only God can do that, right? I have told you before it come to pass, he says in John 14:29, that when it come to pass, you might believe, and that's literally what it is. Now, what he was doing is literally, the Old Testament stories themselves are allegories, and he was speaking in allegories to the disciples. Christ used allegories. Paul the Apostle used allegories. Galatians chapter 4, verse 24, the Apostle Paul calls the Old Testament stories themselves allegories. It's symbolism. It's like a parable. And when you understand the Bible in that fashion, you'll see that there's much more depth to the scriptures than you could have ever imagined. The Jews understood the Bible that way. That's how they reasoned. The entire book of Revelation, when you understand the allegorical nature of the Old Testament, you'll recognize that the entire book of Revelation is found in the Old Testament. All of the prophecies in Revelation are in the Old Testament. The whole of Adventist history is in the Old Testament. You can show that Ellen White is a prophet from the Old Testament. She's pointed out by name in the Old Testament. The entire Old Testament reveals the rise of America, the rise of the papacy, from the very first chapter in the Bible. The rise of America is in more than one place in the Old Testament. It's not just Revelation. Revelation is just expounding on the Old Testament scriptures. That's all it is. It's a revelation of that which was written from the very first book in the Bible. And that's why with this beginning with TRC here, we start in the book of Genesis, because Genesis lays a groundwork for all of the Bible. And if you really want to understand the Bible and get into true deep Bible study, you'll see that you have to get into the Old Testament scriptures, and they bring out the prophecies in Revelation with even more clarity than you can ever imagine. As Adventists, we have a heavy focus on Daniel and Revelation, which is important. But when you understand the Bible properly, you'll recognize that things like the 7 churches, you can find them in about 9 other places, and I'm sure more in the Old Testament scriptures. All of those prophecies were written before Daniel and Revelation, before we had the book of Revelation. We had all of those things in the Old Testament. So if you want to understand prophecy, you want a deep understanding of the Bible, I encourage you to come join us at TRC as we get into these scriptures and their fulfillments. So God bless you. Continue watching. We're going to post more videos as time goes on.